If you take a shovel and dig down beneath the glowing glass skyscrapers of the modern financial district, beneath the concrete, the asphalt, and the steel, you will eventually hit a layer of pure, rusted red. It is a distinct, charred horizon, hidden 13 feet beneath the footsteps of oblivious commuters. Archaeologists know exactly what this layer is. They call it the Boudican destruction horizon. It is made of oxidized iron, scorched clay, and the incinerated bones of the city's very first residents. Before the palaces, before the parliament, before the crown, London was born in mud, and it was baptized in blood. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of a wild, untamed river in the year 43 AD. There are no bridges here, no stone walls. The River Thames is not the obedient, walled-in waterway you know today. It is a sprawling, marshy beast. The fog rolling off the dark water is thick, smelling of decaying reeds and ancient pine. For thousands of years, the Celtic tribes of Britannia revered this river as a god. They threw bronze shields and sacred swords into its murky depths, offering sacrifices to spirits they believed lived in the cold currents. But then, the Romans arrived. The Romans did not look at the river and see a god. They looked at the river and saw a logistical advantage. They saw a choke point, a place where the tidal waters met the inland streams, the perfect location to drop anchor, unload cargo, and push the borders of their massive, hungry empire ever outward. They didn't build a city of culture. They didn't build a city of temples or philosophers. They built a frontier town, a trading post of raw, unapologetic capitalism. They called it Londinium. Within a few short years, this muddy bank was transformed. Timber docks jutted out into the water. Warehouses sprang up, filled with grain, olive oil, and wine from the Mediterranean, traded for British copper, silver, and slaves. Londinium became a magnet for opportunists. It was filled with merchants, bankers, soldiers, and criminals. It was a loud, filthy, overcrowded boomtown. It smelled of raw timber, horse sweat, and roasting meat. The locals, the native Britons, were pushed to the margins. They were heavily taxed, their lands confiscated, their sacred groves cut down to build Roman bathhouses and Roman walls. The empire demanded order. And order, as it so often does in history, required subjugation. For nearly 2 decades, the tension simmered beneath the cobblestones. The Roman governors grew arrogant. They believed their military might make them invincible. They believed the Britons were broken, uncivilized savages who could be bled dry without consequence. But empires always underestimate the rage of the invisible. In the year 60 AD, the king of the Iceni tribe, a man named Prasutagus, died. In a desperate attempt to protect his family, he left half his kingdom to the Roman emperor and the other half to his wife, Queen Boudica. Rome did not honor the will. Rome did not share power. Instead, Roman soldiers marched into the Iceni lands. They stripped Boudica. They flogged her in public. And then, they brutally assaulted her 2 young daughters. It was meant to be a lesson, a display of absolute dominance, to break the spirit of a queen and remind the natives that they were nothing more than property. But they did not break her. They ignited her. Boudica did not weep in the shadows. She rode out into the countryside. She gathered the scattered, broken tribes of Britannia, the Iceni, the Trinovants, and others, united by a singular, blinding thirst for vengeance. An army of over 100,000 painted warriors emerged from the forests, and they turned their eyes toward the beating heart of Roman commerce. They turned their eyes toward Londinium. The Roman military governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was miles away, fighting rebels in Wales. When he heard the horde was coming, he rushed his legions back toward Londinium. But when he arrived, he looked at the sheer size of Boudica's army. He looked at the undefended timber walls of the sprawling merchant town, and he made a cold, calculated, imperial decision. He abandoned the city. He ordered his soldiers to retreat, leaving the merchants, the women, the children, and the elderly to face the wrath of the Britons alone. Those who could walk fled behind the retreating Roman shields. But thousands of civilians, the sick, the poor, the stubborn who refused to leave their gold, were left behind. Imagine the terror in the streets of Londinium that night. You are standing in the muddy alleys. The legions have marched away. The sky to the north is glowing an unnatural, terrifying orange. The distant sound of war horns echoes through the damp fog. You clutch your belongings, hiding in a wooden cellar, listening to the heavy footsteps of 100,000 warriors pouring over the horizon. There was no mercy. There were no prisoners taken. The Britons fell upon Londinium like a biblical plague. They slaughtered everyone they found. They burned the warehouses, the docks, the homes. They set fire to the entire city. The heat was so intense that the clay walls of the Roman buildings literally baked into solid, red ceramic. The imported olive oil and wine fueled the inferno, sending pillars of black smoke high into the atmosphere. The Thames itself seemed to burn, reflecting the towering flames of a dying civilization. In the span of a few hours, the bustling, arrogant hub of Roman commerce was erased from the earth. Between Londinium and two other Roman settlements, historians estimate that over 70,000 civilians were massacred. When the fires finally died down, there was nothing left but silence. Just the cold wind blowing ash across the blackened mud, the thick, red layer of scorched earth that still sleeps beneath modern London today. Boudica was eventually defeated by the Roman legions. Her rebellion was crushed, and the empire returned. They marched back to the ruins of Londinium. They didn't mourn the dead. They simply leveled the ashes and started building again. They built bigger. They built in stone. They built a massive defensive wall around the new city, parts of which you can still touch with your bare hands if you know where to look in the modern financial district. They built a city that was designed to survive. A city that would never again be so vulnerable. But the trauma of that fire, the memory of that slaughter, it seeped into the very soil of the place. It established a dark, unyielding truth about this city. London is a survivor, yes. But its survival always comes at a staggering human cost. It is a city that consumes its own tragedies, buries them in the mud, and paves over them with the machinery of progress. The Romans, in their arrogance, believed they brought civilization to a savage land. But in the end, it was their own savagery that sparked the fire. And it forces us to ask a quiet, unsettling question. When we walk upon the polished streets of a great metropolis, are we stepping on the pinnacle of human achievement, or merely the latest layer of a very old graveyard? For centuries after the fires of Boudica, the Romans kept their iron grip on the city. But no empire lasts forever. By the early 5th century, the Roman war machine was collapsing from within. The legions were called back to defend their dying homeland, and they left Londinium behind. The great stone walls still stood, but the people vanished. For generations, the once thriving metropolis became a ghost town. The docks rotted into the Thames. The grand bathhouses cracked, consumed by moss and ivy. The native Britons refused to live inside the haunted Roman walls, believing the abandoned stone ruins were cursed by the spirits of the dead. They were right to be afraid, because when civilization finally returned to this muddy basin, it brought a new kind of terror. Slowly, greed drew men back to the river. The Saxons came, then the Vikings, and finally, in 1066, the Normans. When William the Conqueror seized the English crown, he looked at the sullen, rebellious population of London and decided he needed a way to control them. He didn't build a monument to inspire his new subjects. He built a weapon of psychological warfare. He built the Tower of London, a massive, blindingly white stone fortress looming over the wooden shacks of the commoners. It was a constant, crushing reminder of who held the power and who was merely allowed to exist. The message was clear. Cross the crown, and you will disappear behind those stone walls, never to see the light of day again. Under the shadow of that fortress, medieval London began to swell. By the 1300s, the population had exploded. But the city was trapped within the confines of the old Roman walls. Imagine walking through the streets of London in the early 14th century. It is not a city of romance or chivalry. It is a suffocating, claustrophobic maze. The architecture itself feels oppressive. Because land inside the walls is so expensive, people build upward. They construct towering, precarious timber-framed houses. Each new floor leans further out into the street than the one below it. These overhanging structures, known as jetties, lean so close together that neighbors on opposite sides of the alley can reach out and shake hands through their windows. They also block out the sun. Down in the narrow alleys, it is a world of eternal twilight. The air is heavy, damp, and perfectly still. And the smell. The smell is something modern minds can barely comprehend. There are no underground sewers. The gutters running down the center of the unpaved streets are choked with rotting animal guts from the meat markets, human waste thrown directly from upper windows, and the putrid runoff of the leather tanneries. The Thames River, once worshipped as a god, has been reduced to a sluggish, gray dumping ground. In this dark, humid, filthy environment, the divide between the rich and the poor was absolute. The wealthy merchants and the nobility wore silks, burned expensive incense to mask the stench of the streets, and retreated to their gated stone estates. The poor lived in damp, crowded wooden rooms, sharing their beds with lice, fleas, and the ever-present black rats that scuttled through the walls. The elite believed their wealth and divine right would protect them from the squalor of the lower classes. They believed the walls of the city kept them safe from the outside world. But a wall cannot stop a ghost, and it certainly cannot stop a flea. In the autumn of 1348, a ship docked in the south of England. Deep within its hold, hidden in the grain and the damp canvas, was a silent passenger. It did not carry a sword. It did not demand tribute. It was the bacteria Yersinia pestis. The Black Death had arrived. When the plague finally crept its way into the cramped, breathless alleys of London, the city was completely defenseless. It started quietly, a sudden fever, a throbbing headache, and then the unmistakable, agonizing swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin or armpit, the buboes. Within days, the victim's skin would turn bruised and black as their organs began to fail. The panic that gripped the city was primal. No one understood what was happening. The brightest medical minds of the era blamed the alignment of the planets, or a corrupt miasma, a cloud of bad air brought on by the sins of the people. To appease an angry god, the authorities ordered the slaughter of thousands of cats and dogs, believing the animals were spreading the curse. They did not realize that by killing the predators, they were giving the true carriers, the rats, absolute freedom to multiply. The social fabric of London did not just tear. It disintegrated. The wealthy immediately fled the city, abandoning their grand houses for their country estates, leaving the poor trapped inside the plague-ridden walls. But even behind locked doors, there was no safety. The terror mutated human nature. Survival instinct overrode love. Husbands abandoned their dying wives. Mothers, paralyzed by the fear of infection, refused to nurse their sick children, leaving them to cry in the dark until their voices faded into silence. Priests, terrified of catching the disease from the dying breath of their parishioners, refused to deliver the last rites. The dead were left exactly where they fell. Soon, the sheer volume of corpses overwhelmed the city's graveyards. There was no time for funerals. There was no time for mourning. The authorities were forced to dig massive, gaping trenches outside the city limits. One of the most infamous was the emergency cemetery at East Smithfield. Every night, men known as searchers would push heavy wooden carts through the slick, muddy streets, ringing a bell and shouting for the living to bring out their dead. Families would drag the lifeless bodies of their loved ones to the doorway, tossing them onto the cart like piles of discarded rags. At East Smithfield, the bodies were stacked 5 deep in the mud, shoulder to shoulder, stripped of their names, their dignity, and their humanity. By the time the Black Death finally loosened its grip on the city in 1350, the devastation was mathematically incomprehensible. It is a verified, grim historical fact that the bubonic plague wiped out nearly half of London's entire population. Out of roughly 80,000 residents, up to 40,000 vanished in less than 2 years. The streets were eerily quiet. Entire blocks of those leaning timber houses stood empty, the doors swinging open in the cold wind, the hearths cold, the families gone. The trauma of the Black Death left a permanent scar on the psychology of London. For the survivors, the world had fundamentally shifted. The peasants who lived through the nightmare suddenly realized a dangerous truth. There were so few workers left alive that their labor was now incredibly valuable. The tight grip of the feudal system began to crack. The lower classes demanded better wages, leading to unprecedented social uprisings. But beyond the economics, the plague shattered an illusion. The nobility had learned that their stone walls, their velvet clothes, and their hoarded gold could not bribe the Grim Reaper. The poor learned that the authorities they served would gladly abandon them to die in the mud the moment the air turned foul. The city survived, as it always does. The empty houses were eventually filled by new dreamers and desperate workers. The plague pits were covered over with fresh dirt, and grass grew over the nameless thousands. But the memory of that suffocating terror lingered in the damp fog of the alleys. It serves as a haunting reminder of our own fragility. We build towering monuments. We hoard wealth. We draw invisible lines to separate the worthy from the unworthy. But when the air itself becomes a weapon, and all the gold in the world cannot buy a single breath of clean air, we are forced to ask, what separates a king from a beggar in the dark? It is often said that history has a cruel sense of humor. For the people of London in the mid-17th century, that cruelty came in two distinct, devastating acts. First, it took their breath, and then, it took their homes. By the spring of 1665, London was a bloated, festering giant. 300 years after the Black Death, the city had learned absolutely nothing. It was still a dark labyrinth of decaying timber, overhanging jetties, and narrow alleys choked with filth. It was a powder keg of human misery, waiting for a match. And that summer, the match was struck. The bubonic plague returned to the cramped slums of the city, vicious and unyielding. They called it the Great Plague. As the death toll began to rise, the wealthy, including King Charles II and his royal court, quietly packed their silk carriages and fled to the clean, open air of the countryside. They locked the gates of the city behind them, leaving the poor trapped in a sprawling quarantine of despair. The government implemented a brutal system of containment. If one person in a household showed the dark, swelling signs of the plague, the entire family was condemned. Watchmen were hired to nail the front doors shut from the outside. A crude, heavy red cross was painted on the timber, accompanied by a desperate, painted plea, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Imagine being locked inside one of those houses. You are perfectly healthy, but your brother is coughing blood in the corner. You know, with absolute certainty, that it is only a matter of days before the fleas find you in the dark. You can hear the watchman pacing outside your window. You can hear the rumbling wooden wheels of the dead carts echoing through the empty, silent streets at midnight. The air inside the sealed house grows stale, thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and impending death. Entire families slowly suffocated in agony behind those nailed doors, listening to the world move on without them. By the time the bitter frost of winter finally killed the fleas, the Great Plague had claimed a staggering 100,000 lives. Nearly a quarter of London's population had been wiped out. The survivors who emerged from their boarded-up homes the following spring were traumatized, starving, and hollow. They believed they had endured the absolute worst that nature and God could offer. They believed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. It began shortly after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. A tiny, forgotten ember in the oven of Thomas Farriner, a baker on Pudding Lane. It was a small mistake, a careless moment in the dark. But in a city built of dry, rotting wood and coated in pitch, a small mistake is all it takes. The flames licked up the wooden walls, hungrily consuming the flour, the dried kindling, and the structural timber. When the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken up and brought to the scene, he looked at the blaze with arrogant annoyance. History remembers his exact, fatal words. He scoffed at the flames, declaring that a woman could piss it out. He then turned his back on the fire and went back to sleep. It was a miscalculation of imperial proportions. A strong, relentless eastern wind was howling through the narrow streets that night, acting like a giant bellows. The fire leapt from roof to roof, easily crossing the narrow alleys where the overhanging houses nearly touched. It fed on the dry timber of a city that had not seen rain in 10 months. Down by the river, the warehouses were packed with the spoils of the British Empire, barrels of oil, tallow, hemp, coal, and massive stockpiles of gunpowder. When the fire hit the docks, it didn't just burn. It exploded. The fire mutated into a monster. It created its own microclimate, a literal firestorm that sucked the oxygen out of the alleys. The sky turned a terrifying, suffocating blood red, visible from 50 miles away. The heat was so intense that pigeons flying overhead had their wings incinerated mid-air, plummeting into the streets like fiery comets. Panic descended. There was no organized fire brigade. The citizens of London suddenly realized that the Crown was not coming to save them. The streets became a chaotic gridlock of screaming refugees. They grabbed whatever they could carry. The wealthy diarist Samuel Pepys famously buried his expensive Parmesan cheese and wine in his garden to save them from the flames. The poor simply ran. They threw their meager furniture into wooden boats on the Thames, while ruthless watermen charged exorbitant, extortionate prices to ferry them to safety across the river. Those who couldn't pay were left standing on the banks, watching the wall of heat close in. The ultimate symbol of this apocalypse was St. Paul's Cathedral. It was the massive stone heart of the city, sitting on the highest hill. The citizens believed its thick stone walls were invincible. They piled their goods, their books, and their life savings into the cathedral's crypts for protection. But the cathedral was surrounded by wooden scaffolding for repairs. The scaffolding caught fire. The flames breached the roof. And then, the unthinkable happened. The massive lead roof of the cathedral, thousands of pounds of heavy metal began to melt. Imagine standing in the choking black smoke, looking up at the greatest monument in the empire, and watching a glowing, silver waterfall of boiling lead pour from the stone gargoyles. The molten metal ran down the steep cobblestone streets like a volcanic river. It incinerated everything in its path, hissing violently as it hit the puddles of raw sewage. The ancient tombs in the crypt burst open from the intense, trapped heat, turning the sacred dead into ash. For 4 agonizing days, the Great Fire of London devoured the city. When the wind finally died down and the flames exhausted themselves, the sheer scale of the destruction was paralyzing. 436 acres of the city were gone. 87 parish churches were reduced to rubble. 13,000 houses had vanished. 80% of the walled city of London was nothing but a smoking, black wasteland. And here is a verified historical fact that chills the blood. The official death toll, recorded by the government, was only 6 people. 6. But modern historians know the brutal, unspoken truth. The heat of the firestorm reached over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to vaporize human bone. The poor, the sick, the elderly who could not run fast enough, those trapped in the slums. They were not counted. They simply ceased to exist. Their ashes mixed seamlessly with the ruins of the bakeries and the taverns. The Crown recorded a low death toll because acknowledging the thousands of incinerated poor would have been a political disaster. In the aftermath, over 100,000 people were left entirely homeless, shivering in the muddy refugee camps of Moorfields as the brutal winter approached. They were starving, stripped of everything they owned. But the king and the wealthy merchants did not mourn the medieval slums. They looked at the blackened earth, and they saw a blank canvas. They saw a lucrative opportunity. They rebuilt London in brick and stone. They widened the streets to prevent future fires. They established the very first fire insurance companies, turning a mass disaster into the birth of modern property capitalism. A new, grand metropolis rose from the ashes, clean, sanitized, and highly profitable. But the new stone city was built on the vaporization of the lower classes. The fire had cleansed the city of the plague, yes. But it also erased the history of the poor, leaving them out in the cold while the elite drew new property lines over their incinerated homes. And as the wealthy moved back into their secure, fireproof mansions, it leaves us with a quiet, uncomfortable question. When the ashes settle, and the elite rebuild their towering monuments in stone, do they truly mourn what was lost? Or do they simply rejoice at the empty space left behind by the invisible? If you close your eyes and picture Victorian London, you almost certainly picture the fog. Pop culture has painted it as a romantic, mysterious mist. A shadowy veil where men in top hats ride in horse-drawn carriages through cobblestone streets, and gas lamps glow with a warm, inviting halo. But the reality of that fog was not romantic. It was a weapon. They called it a pea souper. It was a thick, suffocating, yellowish-green smog born from the chimneys of 1,000,000 coal fires and the unregulated exhaust of thousands of new factories. It did not smell like rain. It tasted of sulfur, copper, and raw ash. It was so dense that on the worst days, you could not see your own hand extended in front of your face. It seeped under doorframes. It stained the walls of houses permanently black. And it slowly, mercilessly, destroyed the lungs of anyone who breathed it. This fog was the breath of a new kind of empire, the empire of the machine. By the 19th century, London was no longer just a city. It was the undisputed capital of the world. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the rebuilt stone metropolis into a sprawling, mechanical leviathan. The wealth flowing into the banks of the city was mathematically staggering. The elite built opulent mansions in Mayfair, dined on exotic delicacies imported from conquered continents, and celebrated their own genius at the Crystal Palace exhibition. They believed they had conquered nature itself. They had harnessed steam, steel, and coal. But this glittering engine of human progress required fuel. And that fuel was the working class. As the city expanded, it divided itself with ruthless efficiency. The wealthy lived in the airy, spacious avenues of the West End, where the prevailing winds blew the toxic factory smoke away from their gardens. The poor were pushed into the East End. Imagine waking up in a tenement in Whitechapel in the year 1850. You share a single, damp room with 2 other families. The wallpaper is peeling, slick with condensation and black mold. There is no running water. There is no sanitation. Outside your window, the sky is permanently bruised with smoke, blocking out the sun. You work 14 hours a day in a match factory, where the toxic phosphorus slowly eats away at your jawbone. Your children do not go to school. They crawl under the heavy, spinning looms of the textile mills, risking their limbs just to earn enough pennies for a loaf of adulterated bread. Poverty, in the eyes of the Victorian elite, was not a tragedy. It was a moral failing. They believed that if you were poor, it was because you were inherently lazy, sinful, and undeserving. To deal with the massive influx of desperate workers, the government passed the New Poor Law, and they created an institution designed to be so terrifying, so deeply humiliating, that people would rather starve in the gutters than enter its doors. They created the workhouse. If a family could no longer afford to eat, they were forced to surrender themselves to the workhouse. The moment you walked through those heavy iron gates, you were stripped of your humanity. Husbands were immediately separated from their wives. Mothers were torn away from their children. You were forced to wear a coarse, humiliating uniform. You were forbidden to speak during meals. And you were put to work. Senseless, agonizing labor. Men were forced to smash large rocks into dust, or pick apart old, rotting ropes until their fingers bled, just to earn a bowl of watered-down gruel. The workhouse was not a charity. It was a prison designed to punish the crime of being poor. But the elite could not entirely isolate themselves from the misery they had created, because the city was fundamentally broken. 2.5 million people were now crammed into London, and the infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of human existence. Every cesspit, every slaughterhouse, every factory pumped its raw, untreated waste directly into the River Thames. The river that the ancient Celts once worshipped as a god had become a slow-moving, biological weapon. It was a thick, dark brown sludge that bubbled with methane gas. In the sweltering summer of 1858, a severe heat wave baked the city. The water levels of the Thames dropped, exposing massive banks of rotting, fermenting sewage to the blazing sun. This became known as the Great Stink. The stench rising from the river was so apocalyptic, so physically overpowering, that people miles away were vomiting in the streets. But this time, the disaster did not only affect the poor in the East End. Here is a verified historical fact. The newly built Houses of Parliament sat right on the edge of the river. As the summer heat intensified, the stench breached the halls of power. The wealthiest politicians in the empire, men who had ignored the suffering of the slums for decades, were suddenly choking on the smell of their own city's decay. The government attempted to soak the heavy curtains of Parliament in chloride of lime to mask the odor, but it failed completely. The smell was so horrific that the government of the British Empire almost abandoned London entirely. It was only when the elite were forced to smell the consequences of their own neglect that action was finally taken. They quickly passed a bill to construct a massive modern sewer system beneath the city, an engineering marvel led by Joseph Bazalgette that finally channeled the waste away from the river. The sewers saved London from drowning in its own filth. They significantly reduced the deadly outbreaks of cholera that had been sweeping through the slums. But they did not wash away the shadows. The extreme poverty, the overcrowding, and the absolute desperation of the East End remained untouched. It became a hunting ground, a place where human life was so cheap, so easily discarded, that women could be mutilated in the dark cobblestone alleys, and the world would only treat it as a sensational newspaper headline. Jack the Ripper was not a supernatural monster. He was merely the darkest symptom of a society that had completely abandoned its most vulnerable citizens in the fog. The Victorian era is often celebrated as the golden age of British power, an era of top hats, grand railway stations, and literary giants. But the true foundation of that golden age was built on the broken backs of the invisible thousands who lived and died in the smog. They were the disposable gears in the greatest industrial machine the world had ever seen. And as we look back at the grand architecture and the astonishing technological leaps of the 19th century, it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. When we marvel at the towering engine of human progress, do we ever dare to look down at the blood lubricating the gears? For 2,000 years, the threats to London had crawled out of the mud, crept up the river, or multiplied in the damp shadows of the slums. The city had built stone walls to keep out armies. It had built massive underground sewers to wash away disease. By the middle of the 20th century, Londoners believed they had finally mastered their environment. The city was a sprawling, electrified metropolis of concrete and steel. But the walls and the rivers no longer mattered, because the rules of human destruction had changed. In the autumn of 1940, the terror did not come from the streets. It came from the sky. On the late afternoon of September 7th, the air raid sirens began to wail across the capital. It was a sound that would become the defining heartbeat of a generation. A haunting, mechanical howl that chilled the blood. The German Luftwaffe had arrived. Their target was the East End, the very same docks where the Romans had first traded their wine, the very same slums where the Black Death had thrived and where the Victorian poor had suffocated in the smog. Once again, history had chosen the working class to bear the heaviest burden of an empire's war. The bombs fell with indiscriminate, deafening fury. Entire city blocks of terraced houses were instantly reduced to pulverized brick and splintered timber. The night sky lit up with a brilliant, terrifying orange glow, crisscrossed by the frantic, sweeping beams of searchlights. The people of London had nowhere to run, so they did the only thing they could. They went underground. Hundreds of thousands of terrified citizens bought a penny ticket and descended deep into the London Underground. The tube stations, designed for commuters, were suddenly transformed into subterranean refugee camps. Imagine sitting on the cold, curved platform of a deep-level tube station at 2 a.m. You are huddled shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Rich merchants, poor dockworkers, weary mothers, and crying children, all stripped of their class distinctions by the sheer terror of the moment. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and fear. Above you, the earth shakes violently. The dust falls from the tiled ceiling with every muffled, heavy thud on the surface. You listen to the tracks vibrate, not knowing if the world above your head still exists. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed. The devastation culminated on the night of December 29, 1940. It is a night recorded in history as the Second Great Fire of London. Over 100,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on the historic center of the city in a matter of hours. The resulting firestorm was so massive that it actually destroyed a larger physical area of the city than the Great Fire of 1666. And yet, amidst the roaring flames and the choking smoke, one incredibly powerful visual motif emerged. Photographers captured the massive dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the very same cathedral rebuilt from the ashes of the 17th century, standing defiant and untouched, completely surrounded by a towering ocean of fire and black smoke. It became the ultimate symbol of British resilience, a propaganda masterpiece used to boost the morale of a broken nation. But that inspiring photograph hides a much darker, verified historical fact. The cathedral only survived because a dedicated, desperate team of volunteer firewatchers stood on the lead roof while the bombs fell around them, physically kicking the burning incendiaries off the dome before they could ignite the timber beneath. They risked their lives to save a symbol of the empire, while just a few miles away in the East End, the homes of the poor were allowed to burn to the ground. By the time the Blitz ended, over 40,000 civilians across the country had been killed, the vast majority in London. More than 1 million homes were destroyed or severely damaged. When the war was finally over, London was a fractured landscape of craters and jagged ruins. The city had survived, but its soul was permanently scarred. In the decades that followed, the craters were filled with poured concrete. The bombed-out churches were bulldozed to make way for the glowing glass towers of international finance. The river was cleaned, the docks were gentrified, and the dark, filthy slums of the Victorian era were replaced by luxury apartments that the descendants of those dockworkers could never afford to live in. London today is a masterpiece of modern survival. It is a city that has conquered the plague, survived the fire, and outlasted the bombs. But beneath the polished floors of the banks, beneath the paved roads and the glowing streetlights, the Boudican destruction horizon still sleeps in the dark. The mass graves of the Black Death are still there, silent beneath the parks. The ashes of the Great Fire are still mixed into the mortar of the ancient walls. History is not a story of the past. It is the very ground we walk upon. And as you stand on the bridges of the Thames tonight, looking at the glittering, invincible skyline reflecting in the dark water, you must ask yourself one final, haunting question. When the sirens wail and the sky is burning, do we finally see each other as equals in the dark? Or do we simply wait for the smoke to clear, just to rebuild our divided worlds all over again? The city is quiet now. If you walk the streets of London at 3 a.m, long after the underground trains have stopped and the crowds have vanished, you can almost hear it. Not the roar of the modern traffic, not the sirens, but the deep, slow breathing of a city that has survived the end of the world, over and over again. The River Thames flows in the dark, just as it did when the Celts threw their sacred bronze swords into the freezing current. It does not judge. It does not remember the names of the kings who built palaces on its banks, or the paupers who drowned in its mud. It only moves forward. Beneath your feet, the layers of trauma are finally at rest. The charred red clay of Londinium, the crowded, nameless trenches of the Black Death, the melted lead and white ash of the Great Fire, the suffocating soot of the Victorian workhouses, the shattered brick of the Blitz. Millions of lives, millions of desperate, fleeting moments of terror, of hope, of quiet endurance. They're all down there in the dark, woven into the roots of the ancient trees in the parks, baked into the bricks of the oldest taverns. We build cities to outlast us. We build monuments of stone and glass to prove that we were here, that we mattered, that we conquered the chaos of nature. But the true foundation of London is not made of stone. It is made of survival. It is made of the invisible thousands who rebuilt the walls every time they fell, who swept away the ashes, and who simply woke up the next morning, and kept walking through the fog. As you close your eyes tonight, let the weight of that history fade. The fires have burned out. The plagues have passed. The sirens are silent. There is only the cold, steady wind blowing off the river. Rest now, because tomorrow the city will wake up and build another layer over the ashes.